You see someone standing outside an office building, taking a drag from a cigarette. Most people assume smoking is a modern habit, a product of corporations, a product of marketing, a product of civilization itself. But what if the urge to inhale smoke is older than farming, older than cities, older than written language, older perhaps than civilization itself? Imagine this. You're standing beside a fire 50,000 years ago. The sun has disappeared below the horizon. Predators are moving somewhere beyond the darkness. Your survival depends on the people sitting beside you. There is no Netflix, no phone, no notifications. Just you, a fire, and enough smoke to give a modern air quality inspector a nervous breakdown. And that was only the first problem. Right now, your ancestors are breathing that smoke every single day, every night, every season, for an entire lifetime. So here's the question. If smoke was always there, why did humans eventually start seeking it out on purpose? Why turn an unavoidable part of life into a deliberate behavior? And before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe, because here's where things get interesting. The real question is not who invented cigarettes. It isn't who grew tobacco first. It isn't even when smoking became popular. The real question is something much deeper. Why would a human being ever look at a cloud of smoke and think, you know what, I want more of that? Because as strange as that sounds, at some point in history, somebody did. And once that happened, everything changed. Let's go back about 1 million years. In what is now South Africa, a place called Wonderwerk Cave was already changing the story of human survival. Inside the cave, archaeologists discovered burned plant ash and charred animal bones deep within the interior. The evidence suggested something remarkable. This was not the result of a natural wildfire blowing through the entrance. The fire had been controlled and maintained by human ancestors. Not Homo sapiens, not yet. The likely occupants were Homo erectus, an earlier human species with smaller brains, heavier brows, and a survival record impressive enough to last for well over 1 million years. And everything started with fire. Fire provided warmth. Fire provided protection. Fire made food easier to digest. But fire also produced something else. Smoke. Lots of it. This is the part most people never think about. When discussing the history of smoking, it's easy to imagine a moment when somebody first decided to inhale smoke on purpose. But long before that happened, your ancestors were already breathing smoke every single day. Every meal, every cold night, every gathering after sunset. Smoke was not unusual. It may have been one of the most constant parts of human life for hundreds of thousands of years. Think about that for a moment. Today, people step outside to avoid smoke. Your ancestors stepped toward it. Now imagine the scene. The sun has disappeared. A small group of perhaps 30 people sits around a fire. Beyond the circle of light, predators move through the darkness. The fire crackles. Food cooks over the flames. Smoke drifts directly into tired eyes. Nobody gets up and leaves. Because the smoke is annoying, the fire is survival, and breathing that smoke was simply part of being human. But here's where things become interesting. If generation after generation spent their lives surrounded by smoke, then smoke wasn't some strange substance entering human experience. It was already there. It had always been there. And that raises an important question. If smoke began as an unavoidable part of survival, when did it become something people actually wanted? And more importantly, why? When certain plants burn, they release chemical compounds into the air. Some of those compounds can interact directly with the nervous system. Others can affect mood, perception, memory, and attention. And here's the remarkable part. Your brain was already prepared for some of them. Modern neuroscience has identified a network inside the human body known as the endocannabinoid system. Despite the intimidating name, the idea is surprisingly simple. It is a communication system involved in regulating mood, appetite, memory, stress, and many other functions. As part of that system, your brain contains cannabinoid receptors. Think of them as tiny biological docking stations. They did not evolve for cannabis. They existed long before any human intentionally used cannabis. But when compounds from certain plants enter the body, those receptors can respond. And that changes the story completely. Because maybe smoking was not an invention. Maybe it was a discovery. Someone tosses another bundle of dry vegetation onto the flames. Nothing unusual, at least not at first. Then the smoke changes, a different smell, a different feeling. Maybe somebody becomes calmer. Maybe somebody feels unusually relaxed. Maybe somebody starts laughing at something that wasn't all that funny a few minutes ago. Nobody understands chemistry. Nobody understands neuroscience. But they understand one thing. Something feels different. And human beings are exceptionally good at noticing patterns. This is the same species that learned which plants were edible, which animals were dangerous, and which water sources were safe. So if a particular plant produced a particular effect often enough, somebody was eventually going to notice. In fact, the first person in history to make that connection may have had a thought that sounds surprisingly modern. Wait a second, do that again. And here's where things become truly fascinating. If early humans learned that certain plants could reliably change the way they felt, then the story is no longer about surviving smoke. It's about seeking it out. Not because they were addicted, not yet, because they were curious. And curiosity may have been the spark that changed everything. Eventually, curiosity leaves traces, and that's where archaeology enters the story. Because there is a big difference between accidentally inhaling smoke and deliberately creating it. One is chance, the other is intention. One of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from the Pamir Mountains of western China. In 2019, archaeologists analyzing ancient wooden braziers from a cemetery known as Jirzankal discovered residues of cannabis that contained unusually high levels of THC, the primary psychoactive compound in the plant. The site dates to around 500 BC, roughly 2,500 years ago. The cannabis had been burned on heated stones inside ritual contexts associated with burials. Think about what that means. These people were not simply throwing random plants into a fire. They were selecting specific plants, preparing specific materials, and creating specific kinds of smoke. By this point, the experiment was over. People knew exactly what they were doing. But the story becomes even more interesting when an ancient Greek historian named Herodotus enters the picture. Writing in the 5th century BC, Herodotus described a nomadic people known as the Scythians. According to his account, they would build small enclosed tents, heat stones until they glowed, and throw hemp seeds onto the hot surfaces. The tent would quickly fill with thick smoke, then everyone inside would inhale it. Herodotus wrote that they would begin shouting with joy. For centuries, many historians assumed he was exaggerating. After all, ancient writers were not always known for restraint. Then archaeologists started uncovering Scythian burial sites. And what did they find? Braziers, burned plant remains, heated stones, exactly the kinds of materials Herodotus had described more than 2,000 years earlier. Turns out, he may have been telling the truth all along. Honestly, when Herodotus said they were shouting for joy, that was probably the most polite way he could describe what was happening. And this changes the story once again. Humans were no longer simply breathing smoke because they lived near fire. They were creating smoke on purpose, selecting it, preparing it, sharing it. What began as an unavoidable part of survival had become a deliberate human behavior. Most people hear the word smoking and immediately think of tobacco. That makes sense. Today, tobacco and smoking are almost inseparable. But historically, tobacco arrives surprisingly late in the story. In fact, smoking is much older than tobacco. One of the most fascinating discoveries came from the Great Salt Lake Desert in what is now Utah. In 2019, archaeologists identified charred seeds of a wild tobacco species called Nicotiana attenuata in an ancient hearth dating back roughly 12,000 years. 12,000 years. Long before cities, long before writing, long before most of what people think of as civilization. The seeds appeared to have been deliberately placed in the fire rather than accidentally blown there by the wind. Nobody can say with absolute certainty exactly how they were being used, but one thing was clear. Humans were interacting with tobacco thousands of years earlier than previously believed, and that changes the timeline dramatically. But the bigger surprise came much later. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus and his crew arrived in the Caribbean, they encountered indigenous peoples doing something Europeans had never seen before. Men and women carrying burning rolls of dried leaves, inhaling the smoke, then releasing it through their mouths and noses. To Europeans, it seemed strange, exotic, almost unbelievable. Naturally, it did not take very long before some of them decided to try it themselves. Honestly, Europeans took only a few weeks to experiment with tobacco. By historical standards, that may be one of the fastest examples of cultural adoption ever recorded. And this is where the story takes another turn. Tobacco did not invent smoking, it simply joined a behavior that already existed. For thousands of years, humans had been exploring smoke, rituals, plants, and altered states of mind. Tobacco became one chapter in that much older story. Not the beginning, not even close. And that raises another fascinating question. If humans were experimenting with tobacco 12,000 years ago in North America, what were people in Africa, Asia, and Europe doing with the plants growing around them? But here's where things become even stranger. Humans are not the only animals that seem interested in altering their state of mind. In the 1980s, psychopharmacologist Ronald Siegel proposed what became known as the intoxication hypothesis. The idea was surprisingly simple. Across cultures, across continents, and across thousands of years, humans consistently seek experiences that change consciousness. Not occasionally, constantly. And according to Siegel, that pattern may point to something deeper than culture. It may point to biology. Because humans are not alone. African elephants have been observed seeking out naturally fermented fruit. The fruit contains alcohol produced by yeast during fermentation. In Siberia, reindeer have long been known to consume Amanita muscaria mushrooms, a species with psychoactive effects. Some observations are even stranger. Reindeer have reportedly been seen drinking the urine of other reindeer that consumed the mushrooms, because some of the psychoactive compounds pass through the body still active. Which is probably not the kind of recycling program most people imagine. Honestly, Siberian reindeer were experimenting with substance reuse in ways that might impress a few modern startups. Primates provide another clue. Various monkey species have been documented consuming naturally fermented fruits and showing clear preferences for them. Again and again, animals appear drawn towards substances that alter perception, mood, or behavior. And that changes the story once more. Maybe the desire to alter consciousness is not a cultural invention. Maybe it is an ancient biological tendency, a behavioral curiosity embedded deep within the nervous system. If that is true, then early humans were not creating something entirely new when they began experimenting with smoke. They may have been expressing a much older instinct, the instinct to explore unusual experiences, to investigate strange sensations, to see what happens. And suddenly, the story is no longer about tobacco, or cannabis, or even smoke. It becomes a story about the human brain itself. Because if the desire to change consciousness is this old, then the real mystery isn't why humans eventually started seeking out smoke. The real mystery is why they wouldn't. And then the story changes again. Not because the plants changed, because the world did. For most of human history, smoke existed within rituals. A healer burned specific plants, a shaman guided a ceremony, a community gathered around a fire for a purpose larger than simple entertainment. The smoke mattered, but so did the setting, so did the beliefs, so did the people sharing the experience. In many cultures, psychoactive plants were treated almost like tools for healing, tools for spiritual practices, tools for communicating with forces people believed existed beyond the visible world. Whether those beliefs were true is not the point. The point is that the smoke usually served a purpose. Then the 20th century arrived, and everything scaled up. Factories replaced campfires, mass production replaced local traditions, marketing replaced oral storytelling, and nicotine became one of the most successful commercial products in human history. For the first time, enormous companies were no longer selling a ritual, they were selling a habit. Advertisements appeared on billboards, in magazines, on television. Doctors promoted cigarettes, movie stars smoked them, athletes endorsed them. Entire generations grew up surrounded by messages designed to make smoking appear sophisticated, relaxing, rebellious, or glamorous. And unlike many of the substances humans experimented with throughout history, nicotine had an additional advantage. It was highly addictive. The more people used it, the more likely they were to keep using it, which meant the business model practically reinforced itself. Now compare that world to the one that came before. On one side, a healer standing beside a fire. On the other, a boardroom discussing quarterly sales targets. One side was trying to communicate with spirits. The other was trying to communicate with the accounting department. Same plant, very different goals. And that may be the most important reframing in this entire story. Tobacco did not suddenly become good or bad because the plant changed. The plant remained the same. What changed was the philosophy surrounding it. For thousands of years, smoke was often tied to ritual, medicine, community, or spirituality. In the modern world, it became something else, a consumer product. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part of this entire story. Because this was never really about tobacco. It was never really about cannabis. It was never even about smoke. It was about curiosity. The same curiosity that pushed your ancestors to leave familiar places and walk into the unknown. The same curiosity that led them to experiment with new foods, new tools, and new ideas. The ability to notice a pattern, to experience something unusual, and then ask a simple question. What happens if I do that again? That question changed everything. A behavior became a habit became a tradition became part of culture, and eventually, in the modern world, it became an industry. But every step forward comes with a trade-off. For most of human history, experiences like these happened around other people, around fires, around stories, around communities. The smoke was only one part of the experience. The people mattered too. The conversation mattered. The shared moment mattered. Today, life is safer, more comfortable, more convenient. You can learn more in a single afternoon than your ancestors could have learned in a lifetime. But convenience has a strange side effect. It often removes the struggle that once gave experiences their meaning. And perhaps that's the real cost of progress. Not that old behaviors disappeared, but that many of them became disconnected from the reasons they existed in the first place. And maybe your ancestors understood something important. Humans rarely seek experiences simply because of what they do to the body. Humans seek experiences because of what they mean, because of the stories attached to them, because of the questions they answer, and because of the people who share them. In the end, the story of smoking is really a story about something much older: the desire to explore, the desire to experiment, the desire to step beyond ordinary experience and discover something new. And that instinct never disappeared. It simply found new forms. So the next time you smell wood smoke drifting through the air, the next time you see a campfire glowing in the darkness, or the next time you pass someone standing outside a building with smoke rising into the night sky, remember this. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors sat beside the same flames, breathed the same smoke, and wondered about many of the same questions. You began this story thinking smoking was a modern habit, but perhaps it is only the latest chapter of a much older story that began beside humanity's first fires. A story driven by a simple force that still shapes your life today: curiosity. And now, I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think humans were really searching for all those years ago? Let me know in the comments.